Anyway, problem for me, I was kind of a train wreck on that first one. So as we get cruising here, we're in this talk called the Atomic Series, and the idea behind this is very small changes can make very big differences. And today, that's also true, because small changes, like just the way we think about a word or a phrase, can radically change the way we think about what we're looking at and the story that we're reading. Now, as I've said before, the Gospel of John, which we're slowly marching through, it's different than the other stories about Jesus found in the Bible. Those other stories, remembered collections, are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're all called Gospels, as is John, but if you've ever read them all, you know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke sound a lot like each other. They're called the Synoptic Gospels because you can kind of look at them with one view, and the reason for that is that Matthew and Luke, which were Gospels that were written later, borrowed from the Gospel of Mark. So you have a lot of sourcing happen there. And then Matthew and Luke had some of their own sources that they added in, so there's a little bit of differences between the three, but they're very, very similar, almost down to the phrases because of that. John, however, more contemporary scholars are saying that while you see some overlay in some things, most scholars now believe that John's sources were entirely independent, which is why it looks so much different than the others. But John also had a different agenda. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they had an agenda kind of like a newspaper reporter. And their idea was to just write down the facts. This happened, and that happened, and he said this, and then she said that, and so on and so forth. But John's gospel, he had a different purpose. Remember what we learned last week, that you've got a group here who were Jewish people who found this new wisdom teacher named Jesus and started listening to some of his interpretations of this ancient Jewish text in a very rabbinical way. And it was a little bit different than what other people were familiar with, different interpretations on things. And eventually, these Jewish people who were trying to be good, faithful Jewish people were sort of disfellowshipped from the synagogue in ancient Ephesus. But they were still Jewish people, and they still wanted to practice in their Jewish tradition, following in the wisdom teaching of Jesus. So by the end of the first century, you have the creation of the Gospel of John, which is a collection, a representation of what they remembered about this Jesus and what he did. And it's written entirely different. It's not written like a newspaper article. It's written more like a novella, written on their remembrances of this Jesus in community. And because it's written in that way, we have to read it differently. We have to know that the author going into this thing is wanting to give us more than just the facts. And because we've looked enough and had enough eyes on the text, we know that actually John is deeply symbolic in a lot of what he says. He takes license where the other Gospels don't, and it's okay. It doesn't take away from the truth that he's trying to communicate. It's just a different way of getting at the truth. And so I want to encourage you, especially if you've been taking my challenge to read this stuff slowly, to pay attention today as we take a slow walk through John chapter 2. I'm going to show you some stuff in there today. And you know, our Western tendency in America, we're so efficient. We want to see how much we can get done. And I think a lot of times we approach the Bible and we approach the stories like this, like a middle school kid who's being taken to a museum. And the point for a middle school kid going to a museum is to see how fast they can get through it to get to the snack bar where they can spend the money that they've been given for that field trip that day. And I got to tell you that adults are somewhat like that as well. I hosted an event for a bunch of pastors a few years ago at the Legion of Honor. And it was sort of this twist on things. I wanted to kind of stretch a bunch of pastors' minds on things. And there was a cool exhibit that was there. And so I thought, all right, well, I'll treat these guys to a day at the museum. And you know what I noticed? That most of the guys who were there were just like middle school kids. Let's blow past this. I don't know what that painting's about, but let's just keep moving on. And we'd rather notice other things. Sometimes we do that in the Bible. Like imagine going to the Louvre in Paris, and you're walking past all these paintings, and you've heard so much about the Mona Lisa, and so you go past the Mona Lisa and you see it, and you're like, saw it, check, Moving on. Well, you may be able to blow through the Louvre very quickly and get through everything in a day. But at the end of that day, I don't know if you would actually have seen anything. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes in our rush, we miss what is right there before our eyes. And so I want to show you what is right before our eyes. And in this particular story, it's actually two stories. They're both fairly familiar. Even if you don't have much experience in church or know the stories too well, you're probably familiar with these two. One's real famous. This is where Jesus turns water into wine. We love that one here in Napa Valley, don't we? Amen. All right, so that's there, and we're going to take a look at that. And we're going to take a look at another one that follows it about Jesus clearing the temple, which is in a strange place for John versus the other Gospels, which maybe I'll remember to say something about that. So if all you're looking for today is what's this thing about, and you just want to tick it off the list for the day, I've got the message, I'm just going to give it to you. It's going to be about Jesus and the guys heading to a wedding in a little village. They run out of wine. He changes water into wine. People are blown away. The party continues. A little bit later, he goes down to Jerusalem, sees some things he doesn't like, turns some tables over, and that's kind of how John chapter 2 ends. Aren't you inspired? Well, that's just the facts. That's the newspaper article. But there's much more. If there's a theme for today, it's more. There's more. Remember those old infomercials? But wait, there's more, right? Let's just try that. But wait, there's more. Nicely done. So let's see if you can keep that up. So let's just walk through this thing and see what's there. So this is the beginning of John chapter 2, very early in Jesus' ministry. This, by the way, what you're going to see, this miracle that happens, is the first one that John chooses to give the reader, which is very peculiar. The next day, there was a wedding celebration in the village of Cana in Galilee. So let's just stop right there. It's a wedding village in a village. It's a wedding village. It's a wedding celebration in a village. Now, back in the day, this wasn't a one-day thing. This was a multi-day affair. This was like a moment when the entire village got to come together and celebrate the love of a couple of kids they've seen grow up from day one. This is a day where, one of the rare days when these extremely poor people would get together and break a vase. They would break the bank on something, and they would really celebrate. This might be one of the few times in the entire year that they might eat a piece of meat, because meat was a rarity, and they might kill a goat or something for this celebration. This might be one of the few times where they get to drink wine because they can afford it, and this is the day when somebody's going to break the piggy bank to host a celebration for everybody. So that's what's happening here. That's your context. Jesus' mother was there, probably because she was helping host the thing, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. The wine supply ran out during the festivities, so Jesus' mother told him they have no more wine. Let me just stop here for a second. Some of the scholars note that there may be a connection between Jesus and his disciples at the party and the fact that the wine ran out. Remember that the guys who were following Jesus were not these Bible scholars, they were fishermen. Have you ever seen how much fishermen drink? I mean, come on. These guys probably sucked them dry within the first hour or two. So here you have a problem that perhaps Jesus and the boys created. And so the person that's sort of overseeing this whole thing, Mary, she lets Jesus know there's no more wine. So far we've got some character sets here. We've got a bunch of village people there. Well, I don't know if the village people were there, but we got a bunch of people from the village there. And you've got Jesus and the guys there, and now you got Mary there, and she's playing an interesting role right out of the gate. The first thing she does is she is a consciousness raiser. So she just states something that needs to be obvious, that we wouldn't know, and perhaps Jesus wouldn't know. She simply comes forward and says, hey, just want to make a note, we're out of wine. There's a problem here, and I just wanted you to know about it. Because in this story, as in all stories, somebody's got to raise consciousness. And Mary does that right here. Next phrase on the next slide, we see Jesus' response, which usually upsets people, especially women. Dear woman, that's not our problem, Jesus replied. My time has not yet come. That's how we read it in English. But his mother told the servants, do whatever he tells you. So when we read this, actually this particular translation does us a favor in that it gives us the word dear. Most of the translations just reads, "Woman, that's not our problem. My time has not yet come." And so we read it like that and say, what the heck? I thought Jesus was this nice guy. And here he's copping attitude with his mom. And we just, part of us wants to kind of roil up and say, watch your tone, young man. This is your mother you're talking to. And we might want to do that, but if we could get back into the Greek, and if we could get back into the first century, we would realize that the tone with which Jesus is speaking in no way has that kind of negativity. It's more like, oh, Mom, seriously? All right, And so all this talk is meant to be seen in a very gentle, loving way, which is why Mary gets this crazy idea to do another role. So she tells the servants, do whatever he tells you, because sometimes there are people in a story that need to instruct other people on what they need to do next. And these servants don't know Jesus for Adam. And so they need to kind of build on Mary's authority and Mary's faith that whatever is going to come next in this story, they just need to go with it. Because Mary has learned to trust what's going on in her son and knows he's probably going to do something, even though he's a little whiny about it, with a wink, and to just go with it. Sometimes we need people like that. And that person was Mary in this story. So, next slide is what happens. So standing nearby were 6 stone water jars used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Each could hold 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus told the servants, fill the jars with water. When the jars had been filled up, probably topped off, right? So they weren't totally empty. He said, now dip some out and take it to the master of ceremonies. So the servants followed his instructions. Now, there's a whole lot here. This is one of those atomic things. We've already seen some small things that if we understood the meaning of just words, it's a very small thing, but it shifts everything. All of a sudden, Jesus is not this bad son with an attitude. He's actually a loving son if we just notice the smallest thing. And there are a few small things here that if you understand what's going on, this story explodes from just an interesting party trick at a wedding to something mind-blowing. And it has to do, to start with these 6 stone water jars used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Now remember, John is a guy who's using metaphor, and he's using symbol. And so when we see this kind of detail, we got to say to ourselves, okay, stop. We got to understand what is being said here, what's going on, what are we seeing here? The first thing you need to see here is abundance. This is a ridiculous large quantity of water in jars. And that's the first thing we got to get. He's not coming up with a case or two. See these barrels here? These each hold somewhere between 50 and 60 gallons, right, Ken? 60 gallons. So what we're talking about here, to use the same, is 3 full barrels of wine. That is a lot of wine. That's going to take, how many cases is that, Stephen? How many? 24 cases per thing. Folks, that's a party, man. I mean, this party's about to get serious, right? And Jesus is going to do something with a huge quantity. And any original reader, one of the things they're going to see is, that's ridiculous. That's way too much. That is an overabundance. Not even a party for a whole village is going to require that much wine. I mean, nobody's going to drink that much. They haven't been in Napa Valley, obviously, but we know it's possible. But in this case, everybody who first reads this just sees, that's a crazy amount of hooch. That's just a crazy amount of liquid. But then we got to back up and ask ourselves, Jewish ceremonial washing jars, So there's got to be something with that that's not just accidental that he gives it. He could have said a horse trough or something, but he didn't. So we're talking about something to do with Jewish. So something is going to happen within this Jewish construct, within this Jewish container that is going to be new and different. We know this because we know where it's going. Something new is going to come out of something old and important. So you see what's about to happen. He's not saying go shatter the jars. He's saying keep the jars. But something new is going to come out of something that is very deep and old. And then one other thing we got to see in an atomic kind of micro way is that it's 6 stone water jars. It's not 5. 5 would still be a ridiculous amount of wine. It's not 7. 7 would be an interesting choice because in Jewish understanding, 7 is the number of perfection. Isn't it curious that the number is 6? Just one shy of perfection. It's as if John is saying, hey, we understand that this vessel of our faith is imperfect. Sometimes we worship the vessel of our faith. And John is giving us a clear indication. We still value the faith. We still value the construct. We value what it holds, what it can do, but we recognize it is not perfect. All that in just a few words. This is more. This is more than just an interesting story about wine turned from water. So he tells the servants, then we get another character set here. Now you got these servants who were instructed to do stuff, and they actually did it, and now they're dipping some out, and they're taking it to the master of ceremonies. So the servants followed his instructions, and now we see what happens. And the next slide says, when the master of ceremonies tasted the water that was now wine, not knowing where it had come from, though of course the servants knew, I'll come back to that, he called the bridegroom over. A host always serves the best wine first, he said. Then when everyone has had a lot to drink, he brings out the less expensive wine. In other words, you start off with a couple of good bottles, then you shift over to $3 Chuck, used to be $2 Chuck. You go to $3 Chuck because people are loaded, their palate's shot, they're not going to know any different, and you keep the party going. That's what he's saying is normal course, and that makes complete sense. But I want to point out a couple other things here. First, this character set of the servants. Sometimes people get wrapped up into things that are significant, and they don't know that they are until they are. These servants, these just hired hospitality folk, they found themselves front row and center in an incredible miracle. And what an incredible statement that is. Because sometimes we're just servants, building on the faith of somebody else who said, you ought to try it this way, and we try it, and we find out that we're a part of something much bigger than we could ever have realized. And so the servants are like that. They're in this thing. They're the ones who know before, really, they're the first to know, aren't they? They're the first to know more than anybody else. These servants, these hospitality workers, these people on the low rung of the ladder, they're the ones who get to see it first. Let that sink in. And that's part of the design. But then let's talk about this master of ceremonies. The role of the master of ceremonies in this particular thing, one of his roles was to be like a sous chef, to make sure it's all ready to go before it goes out. And the other thing was, in this kind of context, he is the acting sommelier. So he's the guy that knows wine. He's the one that can taste this wine that's just been poured for him and say, this is really good, and maybe you should pack this away. I find this very interesting, and I didn't really think about this until very recently. So Lynn and I, my wife, we moved out here from the Midwest, and we were both raised in fairly conservative Baptist homes. Loving, very loving. We weren't the jerky kind of Baptists that you see on TV a lot, but we were Baptist nonetheless, which meant in our time, Baptists and not drinking, they went like this. And so growing up, this was never around the house. I mean, we just never had it. It was just the way it was, and even a little bit to a weird degree. You know, my mom, I remember going to a Kansas City Royals game, and there was a guy who had the audacity of drinking a beer, and my mom was like, I don't know about this, you know, kind of a thing. It's like, it's okay. But anyway, so Lynn and I, when we got married, you know, we were never teetotalers, never that uptight about that, all within manageable control and all that. But, you know, we didn't know a thing about wine. And we lived in Chicago area for a while, and we were dirt poor, eating mac and cheese most nights because we didn't have any money. And on a rare occasion, maybe for our anniversary, we'd go and try to grab a bottle of wine. And, you know, first criteria, what's less than $10, right? And then within the $10, what do? And the reality is, Lynn and I at that stage in our lives thought a good bottle of wine was a Riunite Lambrusco, which is, you know, basically Welch's grape juice with a little fizz and alcohol in it, right? And it wasn't really until we got out here that we started to build an appreciation for the complexity that wine can be and the art form that it is. When we first came out here, sweeter the better. And then we were introduced to some other things, which at first glance, if we would have been given something that really scored a lot of points, and you gave us that to drink, honestly, it would have been a waste of money on us at that time. Because we would taste it like, This is because it's so dry and maybe high tannins, whatever. And we'd just be like, give me the Lambrusco again. This one doesn't have any fizz, right? So it's interesting to me that you have a guy here who is stating what to him is obvious, but I'm not so sure it was obvious to everybody else. I think it is possible that if you have extremely poor people who have not had the luxury of being exposed to some of the finer wines that richer people are afforded, that they would taste this wine from Jesus and kind of wonder if it was the $3 Chuck. And it's like they needed somebody to come along and say, I know what your first reaction is going to be to this, but I want to point some things out. I want you to notice the nose. I want you to notice the texture, and I want you to notice the finish and everything in between. And I wonder if because they had somebody to help them do that, if they were able to actually appreciate what they were drinking. It's like a docent at a museum. You can buzz right by the Mona Lisa and say, I saw a painting of a woman's head. Or you can take time with the docent and have them tell you, well, this is what everybody's geeking out about. They're noticing this and this and this. And then when you look at that piece of art, you're like, wow, that's art. And I wonder if that's part of the role that's happening here, that we need to appreciate the more in the story, because it's there. The bridegroom could have just said, hey, this was great wine, everybody, but it's not. It's a sommelier who's there, who's making it for all of us to see that this is really, really good, the best. And I want to tell you that if you're an ancient Jewish person who's been paying much attention, now when you hear this whole story, you understand fully this is not just a story about some lucky wedding party in a little village in northern Israel. But this is representative of something much bigger and answers the question, why is John giving us this miracle first? John's giving us this miracle first because it is a taste of what is yet to come. In Jewish history, they believed that when the consummation of history was going to finally come to some conclusion, when the Creator and the created would finally be united, it was represented as a wedding feast in their own prophets. A feast where the food was abundant, which meant a lot to people who were lucky to get one meal a day, and where the wine flowed forever. Great news for everybody but teetotaling Baptists, right? But catch that. This first story out of the gate, John is saying, a taste of what will be is now. Heaven has come to earth in a very peculiar way. And the longer they sat with it, and the longer they thought about the complexities of the characters, the more it sunk in, and the more the truth of what was happening was there. And by the way, if you're stuck on the historicity, the factuality of was actual water turned to wine, and you're stuck on that, let it go. Because if that's what's holding you up, you're missing the point. You're missing the point. Whether or not literal water turned to wine is not what John is wanting to have a conversation about. What he's saying is something profound is happening in the life and ministry of this guy, so much so that people recognize that this guy is seriously anointed, and it is changing the world and giving people hope where there was none. Don't miss that. So, next slide. We see what happens after that. But you, he goes on, have kept the best until now. This miraculous sign at Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory, showed what was happening in him, and his disciples believed in him. After the wedding, he went to Capernaum for a few days with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples. So this is kind of like going to South Shore at Tahoe. That's kind of what Capernaum was like. Nice city, a lot of fun stuff to do. This lake, the Sea of Galilee, was about the size of Lake Tahoe. So they're just going for a little R&R. They probably knew some folk before things are going to happen. So this is the wedding, and now we got the honeymoon at Capernaum, right? So everything is good, man. They're just reveling in the wine. Probably they took a few of those jars with them up to Capernaum, so they're just going to keep it on going. Everything's great. But then John does a weird thing. He gives us another story, which is like whiplash. And he puts them right next together, even though it's anachronistic. Even though the story about this clearing the temple, most scholars agree, that happened at the end of his ministry, not the beginning. But John puts it at the beginning because he wants to marry two different things together. This Jesus as the life of the party and this Jesus as a rabble-rouser. And somebody who sees a problem and decides to do something about it. That gets us to the next story, and we'll buzz through this one pretty quick. So it was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration, so Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifices, and he also saw dealers at tables exchanging foreign money. So this is the deal. The temple is where things happen. That's where people experienced this redemption thing, and if they made the sacrifice, paid for an animal to be sacrificed, they felt like that was a substitute for them, so God would take out the punishment on the animal and let them go, kind of a thing. That's the ancient way of thinking. It's primitive and gross and all that, but that's the way they thought. And so that's how that was rolling, and that was okay if you were of means. I mean, they're selling cattle and sheep, which means somebody had enough coin to buy one of the cattle or sheep to be sacrificed on their behalf. But then there's also these doves. Now, each of these had their own little nuance for what kind of sacrifice, but doves were the cheap sacrifice. That's the one you had if you didn't have any money. And so you have people that are selling these sacrifices. You couldn't bring your own. You couldn't grow your own. You had to buy it there. Temple approved cattle, sheep, and doves. And to make matters worse, you couldn't use your Roman coinage to buy that. You had to exchange your money for temple coinage to buy the temple-approved sacrifices. And what happened at that exchange? People made money off of you. So who is bearing the brunt of this system? Why is Jesus about to get upset? Because if you are very, very poor, it's a miracle that you got to Jerusalem in the first place. You've got hardly anything in your pockets, and now you're going to be reconciled to God. You've been looking forward to this your whole life, and now you get there and find out the price of admission is going to more than break you. It's like Disneyland times 10, right? And they get there and realize what was supposed to be this happy time of reconciliation now has been robbed of all that was meant to happen with God. Because now they're not going to feel that reconciliation. They're going to feel constrained. In essence, they were ripped off. Ripped off by people in the temple with the authority of the people who were leading the temple. This isn't an indictment against all Judaism. This is an indictment against some crooked leadership within the tradition that caused problems. And Jesus walks into that. And Jesus made a whip from some ropes and chased them all out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and cattle, scattered the money changers' coins over the floor, and turned over their tables. Then, going over to the people who sold doves, he told them, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." So you can kind of figure out Jesus is fairly ticked off here. He's not happy about this, and the thing he's unhappy about is twofold. One, there's a terrible injustice happening here. That there is an entire massive people group that are getting shortchanged, literally. And all within the scope of a place that is meant to be all about grace and love. And these people are restricted. Those who have nothing already are being restricted from experiencing the love of God because of their income level. This is a justice issue for Jesus. And he knows what it's like because he himself was extremely poor. He knows what it's like to not eat for a day or two or three. And he knows what goes into making that trip. And then to be met with that was infuriating. That's why he came uncorked. He saw that there was a people group that needed somebody to stand up for them because they couldn't stand up for themselves. So that's why he says this kind of stuff. And he goes on, John goes on to say, "Then his disciples remembered this prophecy from the scriptures, 'Passion for God's house will consume me.' But the Jewish leaders demanded, 'What are you doing? If God gave you authority to do this, show us a miraculous sign to prove it.' So Jesus goes on. All right, Jesus replied, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' 'What?' they exclaimed. 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you can rebuild it in 3 days?' But when Jesus said this temple, he meant his own body after he was raised from the dead. Now at this point, we kind of got to knock on John a little bit, because talk about blowing what's to come, right? Total spoiler here. If you were reading this not sure what was going to happen, well, he just blew it. He's going to die at some point, and then something crazy is going to happen. He's going to be raised from the dead somehow. That's kind of mysterious. So John does that, so we know what's coming, which reminds us this is a community that's reading what they already know. It's a remembrance kind of a thing. But when Jesus said this temple, he meant his own body after he was raised from the dead. His disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed both the scriptures and what Jesus had said. Because of the miraculous signs Jesus did in Jerusalem at the Passover celebration, many began to trust in him. But Jesus didn't trust them because he knew all about people. No one needed to tell him about human nature, for he knew what was in each person's heart. The next screen, we really come down to the question of the day, which is on the next screen. There it is. There's more going on here. Hopefully I've shown you that. And my question is, are you getting in on the more or not? So if God is afoot, if God is doing things, the great news here is that this wedding idea, everything that's encapsulated in that, where parts of what God is trying to do everywhere and always has been, God is at work already in the world, and we can get in on that in different ways. That's really good news. You can be a part of something very, very significant, and sometimes we're just the recipient of that. And we're just like the bridegroom. We don't even know what's going on, but all of a sudden we experience this love that we didn't even know was there, and things were happening to give that love to us. And there it is, and we enjoy it and savor it. And a lot of people come to faith that way. A lot of people feel like they've run out of wine in their life, and then something happens, something breaks. Things are going on around the surface that they don't even know are going on. There's more going on, and they're the recipients, and it changes their life. Now, sometimes we're a part of it. We're one of the cogs in the wheel. Sometimes you're the servant who just builds on the faith of somebody else, and somebody else tells you, who's been there, done that, and they say, try it this way. I think it's going to work because I've been there and I know this stuff. And you do it, and it works, and you're a part of something amazing. Sometimes you're Mary. You're the one who is the consciousness raiser. And part of your role in seeing something shift is just to be the one to say, there's a problem here. Does everybody see there's a problem here? We're out of wine. Is that a problem for anybody else but me? There's a problem here, and I just want to draw everybody's attention. There is a problem here. And sometimes there are people who need to say that in the world. And sometimes there are people who get to be the Jesus character in this, where you are actually a part of this. Now, you may not have actually turned any water to wine. I know we've got some people in the industry here, and you've seen water turn into wine, but the really slow way, like through the grapes and then fermenting and all that stuff. But you probably haven't done this kind of a thing. But I got to tell you from my own experience, there have been times when I've been with people, and it's been very clear that they're at the bottom of the barrel. They are run out. And I may not even know what exactly is transacting, but I say a certain thing, and something happens. I mean, something changes. And it's not me. I'm just the guy that happened to say the thing. And their countenance changes. And like you see hope in their eyes. And you're a part of changing water to wine. And I think if you thought about it long enough, I bet you've been a part of that. And you may not have even known it. And that is God working in you, through you. Because God is always about bringing about hope for those who are hopeless, redeeming those who know they need redemption, loving those who feel they're not loved. And so we can stay here. In fact, there's a whole people group I haven't really talked about, and that is the innocent bystanders. Oh, you might be the master of ceremonies, the sommelier too, to point out things that people might not even see. Boy, does that happen a lot. Sometimes you're with somebody and they've gone through hell, and then you walk closely with them and you say, I know it feels like you're going through hell, but I want to point out a couple things that are happening in you and around you, that if you see this hell that you're going through, you might even see, it doesn't excuse the pain that you're going through, but there's beauty even in your hell. Have you ever experienced that? Somebody points out, oh, wait, I thought I was all alone, but no, look at all these people, or whatever. So sometimes you're the sommelier, or sometimes you may just be the innocent bystander. Just some villager there for the party, totally clueless about any of this stuff going on. These are people who are just standing around sucking wine. That's all they're doing. Just people that are standing around sucking wine. And they don't even know that anything is happening, but they're enjoying the wine anyway. I think there are a lot of people like that in life, that they are standing around sucking wine, enjoying the gift of God, which paradoxically is for everybody, to enjoy, to celebrate, to keep their own life party going. It's there. I don't think there's a real problem with that. It's just that there's more. But then there are people who aren't just sucking down their own glass of wine, but there are people in our worlds that their glass of wine isn't enough. And so they work their way around while somebody's in the bathroom or grabbing a plate of food, and they take their glass of wine. Now they've got 2 glasses of wine. They only need 1 glass of wine, but they've got 2 glasses of wine. So they're not just standing around sucking. They're standing around sucking much worse, because they're sucking somebody else's wine when that other person should be sucking their own wine. Does that make any sense? This all makes sense. Work out the math. It's there. You know, yesterday we had representation from our church at the Women's March. And our church has been, for as long as I've been here anyway, I know, and before me, I believe, we've been for gender equality and for gender equity. That's who we are. In our tribe, at least in print, our denominational stuff has been gender equality from the get-go. Whether or not that plays out in all of our sister churches, that's another thing. That's another problem. But yesterday was about saying to the community, and we've had people every March, but yesterday was a little bit more concerted effort to say, love is bigger, and that we're here, and we're with this thing, because it matters. Because it turns out, I don't know if you knew this, but like half the population on the planet turns out to be women. Who knew, right? But it's true. And the crazy thing about half of the population or more on the planet is they haven't been treated equally forever. Even though, right in the very beginning of the Bible, in the very first chapter of the first book of the Bible, it says that God created male and female in God's image, both of them, and that when God saw both of them, the poem goes that God looked at this humanity that was created and said, that's very good. And if you go into the second chapter and you see a more primitive creation story where, you know, God makes dirt-clod Adam, and there's no suitable helper to be found, and so God creates woman from the man and all that stuff. And sometimes that's been an abused scripture saying, well, then women are less than man because it came from man. That's a bunch of hogwash. Because if you look at the word that is used for woman in that story, it's the same word for the Holy Spirit, which is a part of the frickin' Godhead. Equal. And so in the very beginning, you've got signs of equality, and yet, for a wide range of reasons, we've struggled to keep up. Even though there are heroines in the Bible that were championing the day way before any kind of a women's movement or march. Jesus and Paul in the Bible, they were way ahead of their time. Jesus was an equalizer. And Paul was too, even though he gets ripped on because he said in a very specific context, we've got to keep this thing tight, so go conservative on this, while he was wanting a woman to pastor another church in that time. That's crazy. This is first century that's happening. So when we choose to go to a place like this, as a church, we are fully in line with what the Spirit of God is doing. And yet, because we are not in control of the event, and we're just there to say that we are a people of love and grace and dignity and believe everybody should be treated that way, which is love is bigger. It compels us that there's hope, that there's something bigger than the problems that we have that's drawing us forward. And love is bigger means that when we speak about things and when we speak for people and speak up for people, we are going to do it in a dignified way, a dignity that reflects our own personal dignity as people created in the image of God. And the people about which we speak, we are going to use dignified language that is built out of love, because everyone is a reflection of God. And therefore, the words that come out of our mouth, because of who we're reflecting, and the words that we're using about other people, must reflect this love is bigger idea. Of course we're going to be there. Of course we're going to say we support this people group, which may be equal on the books, but has not experienced equity yet and a long way from it. Of course we're going to be there. And I got to tell you that there are some folks, well, this is an embarrassing reality. I saw a handful of other pastors who were there and said hello, and most of them were along our lines of thinking, more on the progressive side and open and that kind of a thing. But as far as I could see, and this is not patting Crosswalk on the back, this is more of an indictment against the broader church. As far as I could see, there wasn't another represented church. And I say to that, shame on the church. Shame on the church. You've chosen to not step with Jesus. And the reality was, yesterday's event was messy. How about that? It was messy. Overall, I think it was good. It raised lots of concern about a lot of issues, but it was messy because people are coming into this thing from different things for different causes, motivations, and all that, and there was messiness to that. It wasn't a perfect event. It's still worth it, still good. And so some would say, why would we dare put ourselves in the company of such messiness? And we did get some feedback on that. And so I just want to make that clear. There's a story about Jesus who invited a very messy guy to join him in his venture. His name was Matthew. He was a tax collector looked at as a national traitor. And Jesus said to this guy one day, why don't you come and follow me? I see something in you. And he left his business and he followed Jesus in his pursuit. He was so excited that he was included and loved by Jesus that he did what Matthew would do. He threw a party. And he didn't know any religious people because they kicked him out of the synagogue. So the only people he could invite were people who really knew how to party. So he had a kegger at his house and invited all of his friends so that they could hear the good news. And also meet this guy who seems to be saying some crazy stuff like God actually loves everybody and really wants good things for you. And I'm here to kind of prove that and show that and invite you into that. And while Jesus is in there having a good time with everybody, some religious folk came close to the party across the street, wouldn't dare go in. And from across the street, didn't have the courage to say anything to Jesus directly, so they picked on his disciples and said, hey, what's your guy doing in there? You know who these people are? There's no way a man of God would ever mess with this. And Jesus hears it. The disciples are waffling. I don't know how to handle this. And Jesus comes out and just levels them in a dignified way, but says, look, I came here to help the sick, not those who think they are well. So run along. And they did. That's Jesus. It's messy. It's the way it's going to be. There's no nice bow to put around what he did in the temple. He saw injustice. He stood up for it. It didn't kill anybody. It didn't malign anybody. It just said, like Mary raising consciousness, this is a problem, and the religious people who are in charge of this show are ignoring it. And I can't stand it any longer. And something's got to be done and said. So whoop, I'm going to flip this puppy over. Deal with that. Because sometimes when you've got somebody who's sucking more than their own share of wine, more than their share of life, sometimes the only way they're going to wake up to the reality that they're sucking way too much in life is for somebody to say, you got to stop sucking because it's killing people. And so when we stand for people who are oppressed, when we get into the gap with people who don't have a voice for themselves, we are choosing to follow Jesus. And get this, it is not an accident that after the honeymoon, Jesus goes to the temple. John is saying to anybody who's thinking about following, this thing is not just a little pleasant, warm and fuzzy honeymoon experience. If you're going to do this God thing, you're going to get messy. It's going to take you into the trenches. You're going to meet some amazing people who've been rejected by the church, rejected by other people, but that is the salt of the earth. You go in there, you're going to start to see God do something. When we choose to do that, we are saying to God, we are interested more than just in the honeymoon. We will follow you even into the places where you already are. Because cover to cover in the Bible, if you want to know where God shows up first, you find an oppressed people group. God is already there, way ahead of the religious folk who seem to know what they're saying and doing. You want to experience God up close and personal? You join God where God is. You get in on what God is already doing. You look for people who are oppressed, you'll find God there. You might have a warm, fuzzy honeymoon experience here and sing some nice songs, enjoy hot coffee and a donut, but if you want to see, if you want to be a part of the action and actually see the world change, stop sucking. Get moving. Join Jesus, not just in the honeymoon, but join him in the temple. Because there are people who need our voice, people who need your voice, people who need you to be the servant, who need you to be Mary, who need you to be the sommelier, who need you to be Jesus. There's more here for you, and it will change the world. Indeed, it already has. But there's more work to do, so let's get on it. Join me in prayer. So God, I fear that in our culture where we really truly proclaim comfort to be king, that we could overlay that right onto our faith and think that the whole thing is just about inner peace and knowing we're going to go to heaven someday while the world goes to hell in a handbasket. The world that you created, the world that you love with people you love reflected in your image. You're not okay with us standing around sucking. You invite us in, and it is a great privilege to do so. So God, help us, revive us, impassion us, revitalize us. Help us not lose sight. Help us know that of course it's going to get messy. But that's right where you were. So God, be with us as we go forward, and in all things, may love be our tone. May love be our ethos, because love is bigger, and it is compelling, and it is beautiful, and it is healing. In fact, it is you. God help us. In Jesus' name, amen. So we have